Welcome back to Farrand Friends Friday. I'm Karen Waltuck, the horticulturist of the Farrand Garden Association in Hyde Park, New York. Our garden is located here on the grounds of the home of FDR National Park site. And while we're closed due to the coronavirus, we're going to be releasing videos every Friday on different Farrand-related subjects, gardening, and anything that you might have a question about. So feel free to drop us an email at info@beatrixfarrandgarden.hydepark.org. So today we're going to be talking about selective editing. In a highly designed garden like this one, you have to make sure that you keep the plants in check, behaving and performing to their best ability. So that means that some of the plants might be a little bit more aggressive than others, and occasionally you might even get an invasive weed that takes over a section. In your own garden, you might have noticed that when a plant gets too big, it might shade out others, or after a big storm, a branch might fall and create more sunshine in an area that didn't used to have so much sun, and your plants might perform a little differently. They might flower a little less or a little more than they used to, and here in our garden, the same thing happens when certain self-seeders or spreaders take over areas that other plants need. Beatrix Farrand was known for her use of plants as a palette, and looking at everything like an impressionist painting with lots of different textures and colors filling up an area. While it can be a design decision to use just one plant for a large area, such as with ground cover under shade trees, or perhaps with annuals to create big bursts of color in your yard, in our garden we have such a variety of plants that we want to highlight all of them and make sure that they work together harmoniously to create a really beautiful impressionistic design. When we have too much of one plant taking over a specific area, the design and vision of Beatrix Farrand is not being executed successfully, so we're going to help keep the beds a little bit more in check today by taking out two pretty aggressive plants. One that's a native, that we're calling aggressive because it is native to the eastern United States, so that's called Anemone canadensis, and the other is an invasive that's also aggressive, that's I refer to as bishop's weed, and they're both pretty hard to get rid of because they spread using underground runners that can be very difficult to dig out, but we're going to try our best today. So in this bed at the Beatrix Farrand Garden, we have plants that are in the color scheme of cream, blush, and gray. So we have plants like sage and yucca filamentosa and some other things that might have more silvery gray leaves, and when they do bloom they have very light, off-white blush colored petals. So even more of a reason to get rid of the bishop's weed, which, if you can see, is a pretty bright green plant. Not to mention it's invasive and we don't want it here in the first place. So in this bed, I actually did have to dig out the sage completely in order to get all of the long running roots from underneath the plants out, but I'm not going to probably do that with more established plants like peony because I don't want to have them suffer before they bloom this season, and it might just be an ongoing weeding project to make sure that I get rid of the weeds as they come up around that plant. So what I've done is dig out a mat at a time. With a shovel, I've just kind of gone about 5 or 6 inches under the plant groups, and I dig it out in chunks. And the challenging thing about both Anemone canadensis and bishop's weed is that they both spread by underground runners. So if I don't catch the smallest little plant or a node from one of these runners, and I leave it by accident in the soil, it's going to completely reestablish itself. So I'm being realistic that I'm probably not going to get every single plant right now, but I'm going to make a big dent and I'm going to keep working at it in the future years. Self-editing your garden doesn't mean always getting rid of plants you don't want. It can sometimes mean moving the plants you want to keep and taking advantage of their self-seeding habit. So this plant, Valerian officinalis, the most common valerian, is actually a prolific self-seeder, and we have it all over our garden. So it's something that I weed out in the summers, but it's also something that I can move and put in a more advantageous place. I know that this plant gets very, very tall, so it's probably not going to work so well on the edge of our border here. It might flop over into the pathways and create walking hazards, and also it's going to cover up any of the other plants that are behind it. So one good thing that I can use this prolific self-seeder for is the area that I've just cleared. I might be able to dig out a few of these and move them over into the newly cleared patch. So now I'm here in my own garden to answer a question from one of our members. They wrote in asking for a little bit of assistance, trying to identify a plant to decide if it's a weed or something that they want in their garden intentionally. And I'd say that's a pretty broad question because plant identification could take up hours and hours of videos like these. But to start off, I would say that my definition of a weed is any plant that's in a location that you don't want it to be. So if you need to identify what that plant is, you have to start honing your observation skills so that you know what kinds of questions to ask search engines or books. One of the books that I like to use when I'm trying to decide if something is a weed or not is the Weeds of the Northeast book. This is a really helpful book that I use actually quite a lot to identify plants that I'm not familiar with. In the Farrand garden, most of my weeding is actually thinning out self-sown seedlings from flowering plants that we have in the garden intentionally. In your own garden, it might be difficult to tell what newly emerging leaves are. Have they newly germinated from a seed, or perhaps they're coming out of dormancy and are perennial from last year? You can tell the difference between something that's just germinated and a perennial by identifying whether it has seed leaves. All plants, including trees, start as seedlings with a set of seed leaves. Not until their secondary leaves do they start to show the characteristics of their true leaf shape. Seed leaves look very different. So if you see a plant coming up from the ground that has a different set of perhaps round or shiny or large differently shaped leaves than their second set of leaves, it's safe to assume that those are seed leaves and that plant is a newly germinated seedling. A perennial coming out of dormancy will never have leaves like that. Hopefully that's a clue that can help you identify a few of the plants coming up in your own garden, and perhaps this is a topic that we'll touch on in other videos to come. Thanks again for writing in. I really appreciate your questions, and again, feel free to email info@BeatrixFarrandGarden, HydePark.org. We'll see you next week, and thanks for watching.